Good evening. Welcome to this virtual conversation about Ellis Cose's new book, Democracy If We Can Keep It, the ACLU's 100-year fight for rights in America. I'm Marcia Eli, Executive Vice President of the Brooklyn Historical Society. The ACLU has played a pivotal role in virtually every battle for individual rights for the last 100 years. And this sweeping analysis of its history is as relevant to today's extraordinary times as any history I can imagine. We're so honored to be hosting Ellis Cose and his conversation partner, Emerson Sykes, tonight. Before I introduce them, I want to invite all of you to share your questions for Ellis by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I also want to say that I hope you'll join Brooklyn Historical Society for other virtual programs. Next Thursday, historian Julian Zelizer, author of Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of a Speaker and the Rise of the New Republican Party, will be in conversation with historian Ellis Cose. And on Monday, we'll be welcoming Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal to talk about her new book, Use the Power You Have, A Brown Woman's Guide to Politics and Political Change. She'll be in conversation with V, formerly known as Eve Ensler, a playwright, an activist, and author of the Vagina Monologues. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Ellis Cose, who, in addition to this most recent book, has authored a dozen others on issues of national and international concern. For 17 years, he was a columnist and contributing editor for Newsweek. He is a former chair of the editorial board of the New York Daily News and was the inaugural writer-in-residence for the ACLU. Our moderator tonight is Emerson Sykes, staff attorney with the ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, and one of the hosts of the podcast At Liberty. Welcome, Ellis and Emerson.
Thanks very much, Marcia.
And thank you.
Shall we dive in? Thanks so much to Marcia and the rest of the team at the Brooklyn Historical Society for having us this evening. And welcome, Ellis Cose. It's a pleasure to be on this webinar with you.
Well, the pleasure is totally mine, Emerson.
Well, as Marcia mentioned, you have had an extensive career. You've written 12 books, including the best-selling The Rage of the Privileged Class, and a novel, The Best Defense. And you have an upcoming book called The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America, which will be published in September 2020. But the book we're here to discuss is Democracy If We Can Keep It, the ACLU's 100-year fight for rights in America. And I'm curious if you can just start by introducing us. I know that this book has a different origin story than I'm sure the rest of your books, but sure. I wonder if you can just start out by telling us a little bit about how this book came to be and what you were hoping to accomplish with it.
Sure. The book came to be indirectly, or in the sense that Anthony Romero and I spoke a few years ago.
And Anthony Romero is the executive director of the ACLU and
right, the head of the ACLU, and I spoke several years ago, and we've known each other for a long time. And he basically said, would you be interested in working in some capacity associated with the ACLU? And we talked that through, and I'm not a lawyer. And I said, well, what in the heck would that be? I don't want to be a PR person, so I don't quite see how that could work out. But as we discussed the idea, what appealed to me was being somehow attached to the ACLU, given its range of activities, given the number of things that it was doing in civil liberties, in prison reform, and other things I was interested in. And basically saying, well, if I could somehow leverage the resources of the ACLU to investigate some of these issues that I'm interested in, and then I would love to be involved formally with the ACLU. So not to prolong the story, we worked out an arrangement and I became the writer in residence there, and never intending actually to do a book about the ACLU. My original intention was to do a couple of other books drawing on the ACLU resources. But once Trump got elected, once it became clear that this was going to be a huge fight to keep Trump straight in some way to keep him on some kind of constitutional path. And once it became clear that the ACLU would be one of the leading organizations and perhaps the leading organization, that was fighting to try to keep him in line, I said to myself, this is really something that's worth spending some time with and thinking about and writing about. And that's how the idea of doing that began. And the idea of just doing a contemporary look at the ACLU didn't appeal to me. So pretty shortly, we got to this idea of a history, and the fact that the ACLU was coming up on its 100-year anniversary made it even more interesting to think about doing a history. But then I realized if I'm going to do a book about the ACLU, I shouldn't be at the ACLU. So I mean, for various kinds of journalistic reasons we can talk about if you're interested in it. So I decided to step down from my writer in residence position and basically to work on this book. So that's how it came about. And I'm glad that I did it, though as we were talking a little bit before the broadcast or the program started, it's really 105 years of history that we're talking about, because the ACLU, even though the ACLU started in 1920, its predecessor organization started 5 years before that. That's a lot to get your head around.
Yeah.
And I think I had no real idea when I started this how immense this subject was, because the ACLU has just been involved in so many things. And America has had so many civil liberties issues that have been pressing, important, and critical, that it was a lot to sort of get through, deal with, try to absorb.
Well, as you said, it's 105 years of history. You pack it into 400 and some pages. And I want to sort of walk through some of the important eras. I think what's really compelling about the book is that it's not just a compendium of ACLU cases. Those can be researched online,
Right.
But this is a story of fights for liberty over the last 105 years, animated by stories about people, personalities, social dynamics, issues that are much bigger than any one organization. And I want to come back to some of those key milestones that you mark throughout that 105-year history, but we are with the Brooklyn Historical Society. So I wanted to just start with just a minute on your methodology. You talked about the fact that you were the writer in residence, but then once you decided to write about the ACLU explicitly, you stepped down from that position. But the research for this, you had unprecedented access. You had the archives. I know you talked to several of my colleagues. Can you talk about the process of collecting information about 105 years packed with cases and social dynamics and all sorts of other things that you weave really expertly into this tale?
Well, thank you. I mean, a lot of it is just, as any historian would tell you, the boring work of pouring through archives, looking at old letters, looking at budget reports, looking at various reports to the staff or whatnot. And the ACLU has extensive archives. They're not all that well organized, but they're
I've had experience with
kept. Yeah. And some of them are at Princeton and some of them are elsewhere. But so I spent quite a bit of time at the Mudd Library at Princeton, going through not just the papers from the ACLU, but before there was an ACLU, there was something called the American Union Against Militarism, which was formed in 1915, and that was basically the mother organization to the ACLU. And then there was something called the National Civil Liberties Bureau, which grew out of the American Union Against Militarism. So going through the papers of those organizations, and the one thing that I will say that's wonderful about doing research in this modern era, in this era where everything is digitized to some extent, is that a lot of the work which requires looking at government records or requires looking at contemporaneous newspaper stories, things of that nature, you can do with computer searches.
Yeah.
Years ago, I did a book on the history of the American press. And that was before everything was so conveniently digitized. And that meant spending a lot of time at the Library of Congress and other places, literally going through microfiche, microfilm of lots of old stuff. The nice thing about getting into the modern era, and the modern era in this case, meaning once you got into the 1960s or thereabouts, there are people actually alive that you can talk to.
Yeah.
And so I supplemented the work at that point with a lot of interviews, of people who were members of the ACLU or were involved with the ACLU, or people who were affected by cases that the ACLU ended up bringing. And I'm glad you sort of mentioned earlier on that it's not just a look at ACLU cases, because I thought that would be, very boring, and I didn't want to do that. But the other thing is that what makes, I think, the ACLU story so compelling is that it's not so much a story about an organization as a story about America's evolution and about our relationship to how we see civil liberties and civil rights, and to what rights we think people retain and what rights the state does not allow them to retain, and how we balance those various interests. And the other thing that I think is interesting, and again, it coincides very much with the rise of the ACLU, is that even though the Bill of Rights was passed almost immediately after the Constitution itself was passed and became part of the Constitution, as we all know, it was not really that well protected, respected until the early part of the last century, which coincided very much with the ACLU's rise. So we tend to think that free speech was something that we always enjoyed, and that it was always been this sacrosanct American right. And yes, sure, it was on paper,
right?
But not really, and the ACLU's rise happens to coincide with a lot of events I'm sure we'll get into, or at least some we'll get into, that made it urgent to take a look at that set of issues, and specifically talking about things that arose out of the First World War.
It's really important, wherever, when you're writing a book of history, where you start. And I noted that you spend, 100 years getting up, or 100 pages, sorry, getting up to just 1925, right? So you talk about the founding, sort of dismantling that myth that free speech and the First Amendment were born pure, and that we're sort of trying to get back to some original vision of liberty, when in reality we had these words on the books for years, for centuries almost, until we actually were able to put some meat on them and really start to have liberty in a way that people could feel and live in the streets. And as I said, I want to get to sort of walking through the history of the ACLU, but let's start with the founders, the founding of the organization, because I think that's really, I want to think about how the ACLU has changed over those 100 years and how it's in some ways maybe stayed close to its roots. So maybe, can you just read, I asked you to identify a passage early on in the book that I think sort of encapsulates the founding of the ACLU, but also how it might resonate for us today.
Sure. This reading comes from chapter 3. The title of the chapter is "The Year That Shook America and Spawned the ACLU." The day after Christmas, hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers turned out to welcome the arriving Victory Fleet, 10 battleships escorted by 21 airplanes. And this is, I should say, right after World War I. The ships made their way through snow and biting winds up the New York Harbor to the Statue of Liberty, each firing off a 19-gun salute, as Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels, War Secretary Newton Baker, and other notables stood in review on the USS Mayflower. But as the thrill of victory waned, along with wartime spirit of shared sacrifice, America's fragile unity fragmented. Xenophobia, racism, and the war between management and labor resurged, making 1919 one of the most turbulent and divisive years in American history. Out of that turbulence rose the American Civil Liberties Union.
Thank you so much. And I also think that it gives those who haven't had a chance to read the book a sense of the really compelling narrative voice that you bring to this book. So let's talk for a second about the founding and the founders of the ACLU. Sure. You talked about it's coming out of World War I. It's a turbulent time, but it was beyond turbulent. I mean, the ACLU in the United States was really trying to figure out what kind of country were we going to be? Were we going to be interventionist? Were we going to be protectionist? Or were we going to be standing on principles? And out of this emerged a handful of figures that you highlight, some of the founding figures of the ACLU. We have Crystal Eastman, we have Roger Baldwin, among a handful of others. But I wonder if you can just situate us a bit with what were the problems that the American Union Against Militarization, which was a pacifist organization, what kind of issues was it meant to address? And then what was going on around it? We know that in the early, right around the time that the ACLU was founded, things like the Palmer raids were happening, radicals of every sort, immigrants were being, disparaged by people in high office, but also, people were facing prosecutions. What was the scene like when the ACLU emerged?
Well, I actually think we need to almost divide it into two steps. And the first to talk about, the organization you referenced was the American Union Against Militarism, which was an organization that was, to shorthand it, was formed by a sort of a group of upper middle class suffragettes who were interested in keeping the United States out of World War I. There was a huge militarism movement. Europe, the war in Europe had already started. There was a huge militarism movement and a preparedness movement in the United States taking place to push the United States into that war. And there were a group of pacifists, basically, who said, wait a minute, we don't want anything to do with that. And they came together eventually under the leadership of Crystal Eastman, who was a Ivy League lawyer, who was very active in various kinds of radical political events, from the day. And at that point, Roger Baldwin was not involved, and they became this very outspoken organization trying to convince Woodrow Wilson not to go into war, trying to convince anyone who would listen that the United States should stay out of this. They actually did have some impact, some influence in keeping us apparently out of war with Mexico, but they did not stop, obviously, the United States from getting involved in the World War. And once that happened, the function of the organization dramatically changed, because obviously there's no longer any point to try to keep us out of war. But what they realized were that a lot of young men who were opposed to the war were going to be conscripted. And a lot of people who were critics of the war were going to be persecuted because there was a Seditions Act, an Espionage Act. These ultimately came to be passed, and essentially it became a crime to speak out against the war. And the whole handling of conscientious objectors became a big issue. And so the ACLU spawned the Civil Liberties Bureau, the National Civil Liberties Bureau, to deal with these questions of civil liberties, the questions of dissent and the questions of young men who were being drafted. At the same time, you had just wholesale persecution beginning of critics of the war, particularly the industrial workers of the world, where the biggest criminal trial in history was held in Chicago federal court. They indicted 166 members of the IWW, the so-called Wobblies, and they tried them at one trial in Chicago. That was going on. The Roger Baldwin at that point had come in to work with AUAM. He was a social worker, Harvard trained, not a lawyer, but he came in to work with AUAM and then work with the Civil Liberties Bureau. And other folks became involved in this fight, to on one hand counsel young men, and the other hand to fight the persecution of organizations like the IWW and assorted radicals who were being persecuted and sent to prison at that time. And ultimately, the Roger Baldwin ended up, he was a conscientious objector himself. He ended up spending time in prison for that. When he emerged from his time in prison in late 1919, the United States, of course, at that point had gotten out of the war. The war had ended. And the question sort of became what was going to happen with this Civil Liberties Bureau that they had formed. But the question almost answered itself, because as you mentioned, 1919, all hell broke loose in the United States. I mean, there were huge strikes. There was a steel strike. There was a coal strike. There was a policeman strike. There was a strike of dock workers in Seattle. All of this sort of came together, and so you saw this big anti-union movement where big business was trying to crush the union movement in any way that they could. At the same time, you had these awful race riots that broke out across America, in Chicago and in Washington, D.C., in Elaine, Arkansas, all over the place, basically with white Americans who were rising up and essentially saying, okay, we just fought a war, and a lot of Black folks got into their head that they now have equality. Let's get that out of their head. And so you had this huge, we spent some time as a nation talking about Tulsa and over the last few weeks, but what happened in Elaine, Arkansas was pretty much as bad as what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the militia and other white organizations and individuals destroyed an entire Black community, essentially because the people in that community, they claimed it was a Negro insurrection, but the real reason was that some sharecroppers in that community wanted to get a fair price for their crops, and they were trying to unionize, and had gone to some lawyers to try to get some help for that, and that made them into insurrectionists. And their entire community got destroyed. So you had all over the country, all of this going on. And then in addition to that, you had the beginnings of the whole Palmer raids, and who was A.M. Palmer was then the Attorney General, and he had decided that he needed to repress the Bolshevik movement and other people who were radicals, partly because there have been these explosions that are taking place on May Day, and lots of things lots of people have been targeted, though no one was actually killed, but there were bombs that went off. So there was just chaos going on. There were the National Civil Liberties Bureau offices itself were raided, and other things of that nature. And the question sort of answered itself when when Baldwin got out of jail, was starting, what am I going to do next? And there's all this repression in the streets, which is the issue that they had sort of gotten into, though that wasn't there where they originally started. It was like, well, God, all this stuff is going on. We have to deal with this.
Yeah.
And so they came together in May 1920 and decided to form this organization.
It's a fascinating story, and you really dug deep into the details of all of the personalities and how they came together and who agreed and who didn't. I mean, some of the things that really resonated, obviously, are the sort of social upheaval, which are similar to, in some ways, what we're experiencing now. People really sort of shaking the nation to the foundations to figure out what we really stand for. But then for the ACLU, it was fascinating. I'm a free speech attorney. I work on our First Amendment work. I especially work on the right to protest, but also on the intersection of free speech and racial justice. And so reading about the founding of the organization, the fact that we were very much on the forefront of the modern conception of the First Amendment. What does free speech mean? As you said, these folks who were against the war were locked up. People who were dissenting from whatever the government wanted to say were being locked up for their political views. And it was the ACLU and others who said, no, that's the First Amendment protects the right to protest, it protects the right to dissent. And the ACLU was really so much at the forefront of that. But on the issue of race, you talked about how the Tulsa massacre and other racial issues were at the forefront of people's minds. It strikes me that while the ACLU was very much out in front in formulating what free speech means in the country, we've tended to lag behind when it comes to race. And that's something that we've seen throughout our history as an organization.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. I think that on one hand, Roger Baldwin, who was obviously the first executive director, was not all that comfortable, I don't think, dealing with racial issues. But I think the other reason is that there was a certain amount of deference to the NAACP. I mean, we talk about these organizations. The NAACP was formed, 1909, I believe, before the ACLU. And the ACLU did not want to tread on their territory. So up until the late 1920s, the ACLU pretty narrowly defined its area as civil liberties, though it would speak out on racial issues. I mean, it issued an interesting report on racial issues, I think in 1921, basically slamming the American society for the way that it dealt with African Americans. It republished a report on Tulsa and events that came out of that, as well. So it tried to speak to some of these issues, but it did not consider it racial justice its issue. In a memo to the board in the 1920s, Baldwin suggested that the ACLU expand its mandate and get involved directly in a number of issues. Immigrant rights was one of them. Racial justice was another one, as a way of expanding its franchise and getting involved in a larger array of rights. And that happened to some extent, but I think it was not until the 60s, actually, when it got full-fledged involved in civil rights issues.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the ACLU board. I don't want to get too much into inside baseball, but you could have written 400 pages just on the ACLU board and all of the politics and dynamics and drama that have happened over the years. From the very beginning, there were folks who said, no, this organization is too radical. There are folks who said this organization is not radical enough. And I think we've seen, if you keep your eye on the op-ed columns, you can, like clockwork, every 6 to 18 months, you'll see either a board member or a former board member criticizing us for one thing or another, which I think in some ways we take as a point of pride that our board.
Well, I think there's always been this question as to who the ACLU represents and what is it a progressive organization, or is it just a pure civil liberties organization? Yeah. Is it fighting for some kind of political agenda, or is it just fighting for the right to speak free? And I think there's always been a tension there. And I think there have also been just some specific issues that the ACLU has not been able to avoid because of the times. I mean, if you go back to 1940, for instance, or even before, actually before 1940, but sort of around that whole era, Baldwin began, he would not call himself a socialist, but I think he called himself a social democrat. Mm. And if you look at his early rhetoric and a lot of his speaking, it's sort of like socialist type speak. Yeah. And he made a trip to the Soviet Union in the 1920s, and he wrote a book basically praising the Soviet Unions and its approach. And so a large part of his career after that was sort of running away from that. Not being thought of as a communist, was not being thought of as a socialist, and a real attempt to try to distance himself in some ways from his younger self, or at least the views that he represented in his younger self. And I think the nadir of that really was the expulsion in 1940 of a board member, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was a member of the Communist Party. She had been a member of the Communist Party when she joined. She had never made a secret that she was a member of the Communist Party. They had at least one other member of the Communist Party had been on their board before, had never been an issue. But suddenly it becomes an issue, and because of the stuff going on in Congress, because of stuff going on in the world, and the ACLU felt that it needed to take a stand. And because it couldn't represent itself as an organization that was just going to crack down on communists, it decided it was going to crack down on totalitarians. And so if you were a member of the German Bund, if you were a Nazi, or if you were a communist, you couldn't be part of the ACLU. Well, they didn't have any Nazis that were trying to become part of the ACLU, so it was clearly aimed at one person. But there's been a lot of that throughout their history. This, and particularly around that issue, but around other issues of how are we defined? One of the reasons that the ACLU was not nearly as outspoken as it probably should have been during the McCarthy era was because of its own history. It took in many ways a sort of hands-off approach, during those years. And just sort of hope that this wave would pass and then they wouldn't be caught up in it too much.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest stains on the ACLU, we have a lot of them, but one of the biggest ones is our sort of delayed response to Japanese internment. And the fact that very early on, the ACLU sort of hung back and stayed quiet until pushed by our Northern California affiliate, we finally did weigh in some of the cases that were before the Supreme Court. But I think it's an example where the ACLU was sort of wrestling with how do we deal with threats in times of war, quote unquote aliens, and what are the rights of immigrants versus just staying with the civil liberties of American citizens. And we could stay in the early 20th century for the next 3 hours, but we have to press a little bit fast forward to get to, I think you talked about Nazis, we talked about sort of World War II, what was leading into World War II. And I think it's interesting that the ACLU sort of has these periods where we really push forward and are really at the forefront of breaking down barriers and increasing freedom. And then we have these missteps, and then we have these reckonings. And I think sort of after Korematsu, we had a bit of a reckoning, and we sort of went all in on civil rights later on in the 1960s. So can you talk about the role that the ACLU played specifically in the 1960s in the civil rights movement, sort of coming to terms with its relationship to civil liberties and race?
Sure. But let me just jump back for just a second.
Of course. I hit
Right.
Fast forward, you're going rewind just a little bit. That's fine.
Just a little bit. To point out that the ACLU was very deeply involved in the Scottsboro case, which was the case of young Black boys who were basically railroaded and accused unfairly of raping 2 white women. It was not out front in that case, but it provided some of the funding that went into it. It provided some of the research, and was very actively engaged in that. So there was that that example of them taking a really affirmative position in a case early on. But with the dawn of the 1960s and the civil rights movement came along, and it was almost inevitable that they get involved, because you had all of these violations of civil liberties that were taking place, of demonstrators in Selma, Montgomery, and elsewhere. And the way that the ACLU initially got involved pretty heavily was defending a lot of these people who were being arrested for showing up at lunch counters and who were being persecuted in various ways for working against the government. It got involved in a lot of the desegregation cases as well, working with Evers and other folks who were involved in the big desegregation battles. And around that same time, in the 60s, it was when it formed its Southern Regional Office under Charles Morgan. And the fundamental reason that office existed was to take on civil rights cases and to fight. At the time, as you of course well know, it was very rare for juries in the South to allow Black folks to sit on juries. So Morgan took on that set of issues. There were all these people who essentially had been railroaded into jail by all white juries. He took on a lot of that. And they just, and they worked behind the scenes, even in Brown v. Board, the big education decision, to help refine the briefs and some of the arguments, that went into that. So I think at that point, the ACLU had basically accepted the fact that there was no way that it could just take this position of being a kind of supportive organization to civil rights without being directly involved in itself, and it was directly involved, obviously, also in the Loving decision, the interracial marriage decision,
Yeah, the Loving versus Virginia is one of the iconic cases in the ACLU pantheon. But at the same time as the ACLU was wholeheartedly embracing the civil rights movement and the push for racial justice, we also represented folks like Clarence Brandenburg, who was a member of the KKK on a free speech case.
Right.
Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's now the representative for Washington, D.C., brilliant, pioneering Black woman, was an early employee of the ACLU. And she represented not the KKK, but basically a KKK-like group on a free speech issue, and she argued before the Supreme Court and won, I believe, was a unanimous decision in that case.
She won. It was her only case before the Supreme Court, and she won it.
She also represented George Wallace to try to get him a permit to speak. I believe it was at Met Stadium in New York.
New York, yeah.
So this is another theme, and I want to bring this up to date because this is also something that continues to be central to the work of the ACLU, and especially my particular personal portfolio. But we represented KKK, we represented Nazis in Skokie, Illinois, for their right to march, and I can give this spiel myself, but I'm wondering from your perspective, how do you see how that fit into the broader work of the ACLU as we sort of tried to find our way? How did that strain of representing these people who stand for everything that we're working against, how did that?
Well, I think it was essential to the identity of the ACLU. I think the ACLU, I know. I mean, the ACLU prided itself on being an organization that would defend, Nazis and members of the KKK and things of this, because their ultimate argument was that free speech had to be a defense of anybody, and any objectionable speech or the speech that we hate, as they would call it, had to be defended as well as speech that we like. In the 1930s, mid-1930s, the ACLU produced a pamphlet, Why We Defend Nazis was, I'm paraphrasing the title, but that was basically the title of it, and making the argument then that it made again in 1970s when it was slammed for defending people in Skokie, not people in Skokie, but the Nazis who wanted to march on Skokie, and it always has come up with the same answer, which basically is that we have to defend these people who are totally objectionable because we are defending the principle here, not the thought itself, and that if we don't defend them, and then we can't defend civil rights workers in the South, and we can't defend other people who are speaking up for rights speaking up for causes and people that we really do think are worthwhile. What's interesting, and I think where you're moving, is that has pretty much been accepted as sort of ACLU holy writ within the ACLU itself. I mean, Skokie was a case where they got a huge amount of blowback, particularly from members of the Jewish community, for taking the side of these neo-Nazis who were going to march through Skokie, which at the time had many survivors of the Holocaust living there, just to create trouble. And people were saying, "Why are you defending these creeps?" And people threatened to leave the organization. It was a big membership crisis. The crisis, as I stated in the book, was somewhat over dramatized because it wasn't really as dire as it was made to seem, and the money that was withdrawn wasn't as significant as people sort of pretended or thought it was for various reasons. But this issue of defending people like that was very, very important to the organization. The attorney who, Jesus, I'm blanking his name right now, but the attorney who was in Chicago, who was a young attorney at the time, was a Jewish, David Goldberger, who was the lead attorney on the Skokie case, was Jewish. He got hounded by people in the synagogue. He got criticized. He took a lot of heat for it. And I interviewed him for the book, and we were speaking, and he said, I understood why I needed to do this, and I understood it was the right position, for the organization to take. So I never hesitated. So now we flash forward to Charlottesville, where a few years ago, in 2017, the ACLU defended, along with another organization in Virginia, I think with the Rutledge organization, I think something like that.
Rutherford Institute, yeah.
Yeah. In Virginia, defended these neo-Nazis who had insisted on having this march. And they wanted to have a march in the center of town, in the park in the center of town, and the city said, no, we have put you in a park somewhere away from the center that's easier to defend, that's better access for the police. And the ACLU, and again, there was a Black woman who was a legal director in Virginia at the time, said, no, that's not acceptable. This is a free speech issue. You have to let these people speak where they want to speak about what they want to speak, and the city backed down, and it became a tragedy because the protest itself never really happened. I mean, there was the protest the night before where they went to the University of Virginia and created disruption, and ended up having some people got arrested. And then the event itself became so fraught with the potential for violence that the police decided to call it off before it actually occurred. But out of that, one Nazi sympathizer who was involved decided to ram his car into a crowd and killed a woman and injured several others. And after that, the people who are in the ACLU were saying, "My God, what are we defending here?" And one big difference is that the old ACLU, by the old ACLU, I mean the ACLU of a generation ago, didn't have very many Black folks in it. Didn't have very many people of color. It did have quite a number of Jews, but there was no civil rights division, of the ACLU at the time, even though they did deal with civil rights issues. The modern ACLU has all of those things. So some of those people, among others, were saying, well, wait a minute. Okay, I'm all for free speech, but are people marching around going blood and soil and spreading hate? Is that speech, or is that just something else? And I don't think that debate is still resolved. I think it's still resounding within the organization and within the society as we try to figure out what are the limits of free speech, because the other thing, and I know I'm going on a little bit, but the other thing I think is worth pointing out though is that none of these absolute positions end up being logical in the final analysis anyway, because there have always been limits on speech. I mean, the classical shouting fire in a burning theater limit, the fighting words limit, can you say things that are going to compel someone to violent behavior? So there have always been limits of some sort on speech, even once we decided, and we have never really talked about that, how we decided that we really did believe in free speech. But even once we decided that we did believe in free speech as a society, there have always been limits on it. And I think we have a new debate now, one that comes in part from things like the event in Charlotte, but also come from just people witnessing the rise of this far right neo-Nazi or sort of white supremacist movement, and people also trying to figure out what's happening online, and to what extent unmoderated behavior online becomes an engine driving a lot of this behavior into society. So I think we're in a period of there will be of huge debate over these issues for a while.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, my position at the ACLU very much came out of Charlottesville, to be honest with you. My sort of work specifically on racial justice and free speech was created in response to the idea that the ACLU wasn't doing a great job either internally or externally of sort of bridging that gap and making the case for free speech in a way that acknowledged the ways in which race sort of permeates everything, including how we regulate speech in America. And I mean, I could go on and on and on about that particular issue, but I think what it brings us to is the modern ACLU, the ACLU of today. I mean, the other sort of, there's a lot happened between the 60s and today. The ACLU was hugely active after 9/11 in terms of the working against torture and trying to have rights for folks who were detained at Guantanamo, the black sites that the CIA was using for detainees. All of that work is hugely important. Unfortunately, we don't have time for all of the details of all of that. But I think if we fast forward to today and we think about sort of the ACLU in the age of Trump, it hurts my mouth to even say that, but the ACLU, the modern ACLU, dealing with immigration issues on a daily basis, voting rights on a daily basis, reproductive freedom on a daily basis. We're also fighting for women's rights, for racial justice. And of course, we're now seeing massive demonstrations in the streets And so the ACLU has been hugely active protecting protesters' rights from the use of excessive force by police officers. So when you look at what's happened since our 45th president was elected and the ways in which the ACLU has shifted focus, I'm wondering, do you see more continuity with our founding principles, or do you see that we're really doing something quite different? We have critics who say that we've abandoned our original principles and we're just, tools of the political left. You have others who are saying that we're too stuck in our ways and we continue to defend unpopular beliefs, even though, we have a white supremacist. I mean, arguably every president has been a white supremacist other than Obama, but we have an outwardly racist president. How much has the game changed? How much did these ACLU change?
I think it's changed a lot, but I think there's a lot of continuity also. I mean, you reference a whole issue of immigrant rights. Going back to the Palmer raids we were talking about, I mean, that was an anti-immigrant effort.
Yeah.
It was an effort directed at trying to, get immigrants out of the country. I mean, it was specific kinds of immigrants that were considered radicals and Bolsheviks and things of that nature. But there was actually a ship that Emma Goldman was put on, along with several hundred others who were sent to Russia. So that was very much an effort targeting immigrants. And so in that sense, you see continuity with that. You see continuity with a number of the issues you reference and the ACLU. But what has happened is that and also something else as well. I mean, the whole involvement of the ACLU in political issues, has been a hot issue. And again, going back to the ACLU taking the position that Richard Nixon ought to be impeached. There have been people saying the ACLU is getting involved in politics, it shouldn't be doing this, or the ACLU taking positions on the appointment of various justices to the Supreme Court. People saying, wait a minute, this is not what the ACLU does. We're supposed to be this organization. So there's, throughout the evolution of the ACLU, there have been these battles over when it should get involved, when it shouldn't get involved, when it's crossing the line, when it's not crossing the line. And I think that's going to continue. I think what becomes difficult with someone like Trump, who seems to threaten so much about American society, not just on issues that the ACLU has been traditionally comfortable with, but just across the board. It becomes, if the ACLU is presenting itself as sort of a nonpartisan organization, and then how do you show that you're equally as tolerant with Democrats and Republicans? If it's mostly Republicans who are doing things that are terribly objectionable to you, and that becomes, I think, a difficult issue in and of itself. And then when you layer on that the fact that the ACLU is a fundamentally transformed organization just because of resources.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, if you go back even to when Romero took over, I believe the budget of the ACLU at that point was somewhere in the neighborhood of $60 million, $70 million. Don't quote me on this, but it was significantly less than the close to 400 million it is now. Yeah. The staff was a fraction of what it was, what it has become. So part of, and I've asked the question you asked with the ACL, with various members of the ACL leadership, and part of what they say is that, well, we've always tried to do some of these things, but we never had the resources to do them before. We didn't have the resources to take out ads that were opposing the positions of various candidates or to support not congressional, but to support voter initiatives. Yeah. And we don't have those resources. So we're doing that. Their model is, well, we're not abandoning anything we ever did. We're just being more effective at the things we did a little bit of. And I think there's a little bit of disingenuousness to that answer, because I think that the ACLU is more involved in sort of partisan political issues of the sort that it had frowned on at one point. But I think it's difficult not to be for them institutionally, given what they care about. Mm-hmm. And I think the ACLU also, and this maybe gets us almost back to where we started, has always sort of struggled with what it is, because it's not an organization that just a bunch of lawyers got together one day and said, wow, we really think the Bill of Rights is important. Let's protect that.
Yeah.
It began as a progressive organization that was fighting for a cause. And part of what the leadership felt at the time was that the instrument to wage that battle was the Bill of Rights. And that by getting free speech as accepted as a right, they were also serving their other agenda, which was a, be quite frank about it, a progressive political agenda. So I think that to some extent, there's always been a little bit of a false struggle, because whatever you consider the ACLU, even in its formative years, you did not consider it a right-wing outfit. It was something other than that.
Yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, right? Like if we have these progressive roots, and if one party is in favor of the Bill of Rights and the other it seems to want to ignore it in large instances, you might, as Anthony Romero often says, like, why would we be quiet just because one politician on one side agrees with us? And you tell a really compelling story in the book about Anthony Romero meeting with President Obama and really making him very angry by pushing him on the ways in which Obama continued some of President Bush's policies around counterterrorism. While Obama had promised to close Guantanamo Bay, he was unsuccessful in that. He continued many of the policies of President Bush, and the ACLU spent most of President Obama's administration fighting him on national security issues for increased transparency, for increased rights of prisoners, and all those sorts of issues. So we have a track record as a progressive organization, but we also have a track record, I think, that we can stand firm on, of fighting power, or at least trying to hold powerful folks in check in one way or another. So it's interesting to hear how you sort of reflect back on these 100 years. But I wonder, we only have a few minutes left. I want to bring us to sort of the very present day in terms of what the ACLU is doing. Someone's asked a question about what the ACLU is doing, in the midst of the current crisis, where we have not only a global pandemic, but also these massive demonstrations against police brutality, for Black lives. The specific question maybe I can just handle quickly, which is about, is the ACLU pursuing any pandemic cases on the right to worship, or other sort of restrictions on the crowds? And I can just say quickly, we have been watching these issues quite closely. Obviously, in a global pandemic, you're going to have some restrictions on civil liberties. But we don't want to just give a blank check for government to regulate civil liberties in any way they want just because there is a pandemic. It has to be rational. It has to be based on medical evidence. It has to be proportionate. It has to be time constrained. It can't be a permanent change just because of a temporary problem. So we are really watching, especially to make sure that certain kinds of gatherings aren't privileged over others. And that it's not based on the viewpoint that's being expressed in those gatherings, but rather, the actual risk of spreading COVID-19, or other sort of rational bases for differentiating among gatherings. But I'm wondering, as you see what's going on in the streets across America and indeed globally, and seeing ACLU's response, what do you think when you, with your now extensive, detailed background understanding of the ACLU, what do you make of our current interventions in the current crisis?
I mean, I think the ACLU is doing what it's been doing for a while. I mean, it's, we've have new issues arising with the detention of children. I think, the ACLU is on that. We have issues about prisoners and how they should be treated. Who are particularly susceptible to this virus now. I don't see any big change because of the pandemic in how the ACLU is positioning itself. I think particularly over the last 4 years, when it's made it very clear that it's trying to fight a battle to make America be more responsive to the concerns and to the rights and freedoms that this president seems to want to erode. It's continuing to do that. I think that's going to be, it's going to be episodic because society works in episodic ways, and it's going to tackle individual issues that have to do with that whole array of issues.
Well, we just have a couple of minutes left, but I just wanted to look a bit forward. And I know you have a forthcoming book called The Short Life and, sorry, is it The Short Life
Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech.
Curious Death of Free Speech, which doesn't sound exactly a hopeful tone for the future, at least of the concept of free speech. But I'm wondering, as you look forward and you think about the fight for civil liberties, and particularly the ACLU, what do you see moving forward? I gather you're not extremely hopeful, but I wonder if you can let us know where your thoughts are at the moment.
Well, I don't know if hopeful or unhopeful is a way to describe it. I think that I'm pretty insistent on just looking at reality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there was, and this is probably as good a way as any to sort of move towards how this all comes together. I mean, the view of the ACLU going back to its foundings was that if you allow voices to speak up, to speak out, and then the truth will be heard, and good things will happen. I mean, that was fundamentally Louis Brandeis's view, that good speech ultimately is going to drive out bad speech. And that we're going to make good decisions and we're going to be a good society because we are allowing all this speech to happen. Part of the argument, I'm not going to get deeply into this obviously, but part of the argument in the new book is that maybe that conclusion is flawed. Maybe this idea that good speech necessarily drives out bad doesn't make any sense, particularly when you have people who are articulating bad speech who have lots of resources, lots of money, lots of access, to media, and can drive that speech home in a way that other people can't. And especially when the proponents of bad speech employ groupthink and outright lies, to get to where they want you to get you to where they want you to be. And so part of the argument of the new book is that our idea that free speech was going to set us free was naive. Yeah. And that we really need to take a harder look at what that requires.
Yeah, I mean, I'm someone who works every day trying to protect free speech and the right to protest in the First Amendment, but I'm under no delusions that free speech on its own inevitably leads to good results. I was talking to a colleague this morning about how it's a necessary but insufficient condition for freedom and democracy. But I'm curious if you can just give us some parting words about what you hope that readers will learn and come away with after they look at this 105-year history of the ACLU. They read about all of these historical moments that the ACLU was at least adjacent to, if not directly involved in. What do you think the lessons are for the modern reader, and what do you hope people carry forward with them?
The one big lesson I hope people will get is how easy it is to get comfortable with the idea that ideas you don't like ought to be repressed. How easy it is to get comfortable with the idea that people saying things you don't like ought to be repressed, ought to be sent away, ought to be mistreated. And how easy Americans fall into this idea that whatever we don't like about society is caused by immigrants or other people who are different. And therefore we're going to do things to those people. Something that's been consistent and throughout American history, not just over the last 100 years, is that we've done that. We've demonized people who aren't really the cause of the problems we're demonizing them for. Yeah. And I think it's useful sometimes to look back and see how we've done that. And with the benefit of hindsight and history, we now know what was wrong in the past, but we don't necessarily make that connection to the present.
Well, as you said, the organization was born in tumultuous times, and we find ourselves again in tumultuous times, but now at least we're armed with your book to help us guide the way. So Ellis Cose, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Thank you so much for your decades of phenomenal writing, and thanks especially for this book, Democracy If We Can Keep It. Go on out and buy it. It's available now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emerson. It's been a real pleasure.
Marcia, do you want to come back and say goodbye?
I guess we're all done. Okay.